The war fleet emerged from hyperspace like a swarm of silver locusts, each ship the size of a city block and bristling with weapons that could crack planets. Commander Vexthor stood on the bridge of the flagship Dominance, his three eyes scanning the holographic display before him. The blue marble of Earth hung in the void, undefended and ripe for conquest. He clicked his mandibles together in satisfaction. This would be his easiest victory yet. The Krell Empire had conquered 47 star systems in the past decade. Their technology was unmatched. Their weapons systems could project force across light years. Their shield generators could absorb the output of a star. Their soldiers wore powered armor that made them nearly invincible, and now they had found Earth. A primitive world still struggling with chemical rockets and nuclear fission. The humans would fall within hours. Vexthor had studied the human transmissions. He had watched their entertainment broadcasts, read their digital communications, analyzed their military capabilities. They were a fractured species, divided by imaginary lines on their planet's surface, constantly fighting among themselves over resources and ideas. They had weapons, certainly, but nothing that could penetrate Krell shields. Their nuclear arsenals were toys compared to what the Dominance carried in a single weapons pod. He opened a communication channel to all ships in the fleet. The message was simple and had been translated into the primary human languages: surrender or face extinction. He expected immediate capitulation, and every other species had crumbled when faced with Krell superiority. The humans would be no different. The response came faster than he anticipated. A single transmission from the planet's surface, originating from a complex the humans called the United Nations. An elderly human male appeared on screen, dressed in formal attire, his face lined with age, but his eyes sharp with intelligence. Secretary General Chen spoke in English, his voice calm and measured. "We have received your ultimatum. We reject it. You may have superior technology, but we have something you cannot measure on your instruments. We have 5,000 years of stubborn refusal to kneel. We have survived ice ages and plagues. We have rebuilt from ashes more times than you have conquered worlds. If you want Earth, you will have to take it. And we promise you this: the cost will be higher than you can imagine." Vexthor found the speech amusing. Empty threats from a species that still used projectile weapons and chemical propellants. He gave the order to begin the invasion. The fleet moved into assault formation. Kinetic strike platforms locked onto major population centers. The first bombardment would demonstrate the futility of resistance. Then ground forces would land and begin pacification operations. By the end of the local day cycle, Earth would be under Krell control. The bombardment began at dawn. Tungsten rods dropped from orbit, accelerated to tremendous velocities by magnetic launchers. Each rod carried the kinetic energy of a nuclear weapon, but left no radiation. They struck military installations across the globe, command centers, missile silos, naval bases, and Air Force installations. The targets disintegrated under the assault. Vexthor watched the destruction with professional satisfaction. Phase 1 was proceeding perfectly. Then something unexpected happened. The humans did not surrender. They did not panic. They adapted. Military units that survived the initial strikes dispersed into civilian areas, blending with the population. Government functions relocated to hidden bunkers. Communication networks, knocked offline by the bombardment, were quickly replaced by improvised systems using technology the Krell scanners could not easily distinguish from background noise. The first landing craft descended through the atmosphere, carrying assault troops in powered armor. They landed in what had been New York City, now a smoking ruin from the orbital bombardment. And the troops deployed in standard formation, energy weapons charged and ready. The city appeared deserted. Sensors showed no life signs. The squad leader, a veteran of 20 campaigns, felt uneasy. Something was wrong. The silence was too complete. The attack came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Humans emerged from rubble, from sewers, from buildings that scanners had marked as uninhabitable. They carried primitive weapons, firearms, and explosives that should not have posed a threat to Krell armor. But they did not attack the armor directly. They targeted joints, sensor arrays, power conduits. They used the environment, collapsing buildings onto troops, igniting gas lines, creating kill zones in narrow streets where the Krell's superior firepower became a liability. The squad leader called for support, but his communication was jammed by crude but effective electronic warfare. His sensors showed contradictory readings, phantom contacts that drew fire away from real threats. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found the squad scattered and damaged. 3 troopers completely disabled, the rest fallen back to defensible positions. No bodies. The humans had taken their dead and wounded with them, disappearing back into the ruins like ghosts. Vexthor reviewed the combat reports with growing irritation. The invasion was not proceeding as planned. Ground forces were taking casualties. Not many, but any casualties against a technologically inferior opponent were unacceptable. The humans were fighting with a creativity that defied logical analysis. They used tactics the Krell database had no protocols for. They seemed to anticipate Krell responses and counter them before they could be implemented. The problem was that Krell tactics were based on technological superiority. Their doctrine assumed the enemy would fight conventionally, using their own best technology against Krell shields and weapons. The Krell would simply outlast them, their superior systems eventually grinding down any opposition. But the humans were not fighting that way. They were fighting like they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They used improvisation, deception, psychological warfare. They turned their cities into mazes of traps and ambushes. They made every block a battlefield and every building a fortress. More disturbing reports began arriving. Human resistance groups were not just fighting with weapons. They were fighting with information. Our Krell communications were being intercepted and decoded despite quantum encryption. Supply routes were being identified and ambushed. Landing zones were being mined before ships arrived. The humans were demonstrating an intelligence-gathering capability that should not have been possible with their limited technology. They were reading Krell movements and adapting faster than the fleet could respond. A captured human soldier was brought aboard the Dominance for interrogation. She was young, barely out of adolescence by human standards, wearing improvised armor made from scavenged materials and carrying a weapon that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. She had been separated from her unit during a firefight and cornered by a Krell patrol. She had injured 2 soldiers before being subdued with neural stunners. Vexthor entered the interrogation chamber expecting fear, perhaps defiance, but certainly not what he encountered. The human sat calmly, her wrists bound but her posture relaxed. She looked at him with curiosity rather than terror. When he activated the translator and demanded to know her unit's positions and strength, she smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something you did not. "You want to know why you're losing?" she asked. "It's because you don't understand us. You have better weapons, better armor, better ships. But we have something you don't. We have 5,000 years of making war on ourselves. We've perfected every possible way to kill each other. We've studied warfare from stone axes to nuclear missiles. We've written books about it, made movies about it, played games about it. Every child on Earth knows the stories of warriors who fought against impossible odds and won." Vexthor clicked his mandibles in dismissal. "Your primitive conflicts are irrelevant. We have conquered species far more advanced than yours." "Advanced in technology? Maybe," the human replied. "But were they advanced in killing? Did they spend millennia perfecting the art of war? We humans are good at 2 things, adapting and surviving. You knocked out our command centers. We moved command to smartphones and encrypted messengers. You destroyed our bases. We fought from our homes. You cut our supply lines. We made weapons from whatever we could find. You tried to break our spirit with bombardment. But we've been bombing each other for 100 years. We know how to live through it and keep fighting. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with an emotion Vexathor could not quite identify. You want to know the real problem? You came here thinking you were fighting an army. You're not. You're fighting an entire species that has weaponized everything we are. Our creativity, our stubbornness, our anger, our love for our home, our refusal to give up even when logic says we should. You can't beat that with better guns. You can only beat that by being willing to sacrifice more than we are. And I promise you we're willing to sacrifice everything. Vexthor left the interrogation chamber disturbed. He returned to the bridge and pulled up casualty reports. 3 weeks into the invasion, and the Krell fleet had lost more troops than in the previous year of campaigning combined. Ground forces were requesting reinforcements daily, and supply ships were being harassed by human vessels, civilian craft retrofitted with weapons and piloted by volunteers on suicide missions. The orbital blockade was holding, but barely, and Earth's population was not breaking. If anything, human resistance was intensifying. He pulled up a tactical analysis prepared by his senior officers. The projection was sobering. At current attrition rates, the fleet would need to commit every available ship to hold Earth. That would leave the entire eastern border of the Empire undefended. And even then, victory was not guaranteed. The humans had demonstrated an unsettling ability to escalate. They were adapting Krell weapons, incorporating captured technology into their own systems. Some reports even suggested they were reverse engineering shield generators and power cores. But the final straw came during an assault on what had been Chicago. A full battalion of Krell shock troops, supported by heavy armor and orbital fire support, pushed into the city center. They encountered fierce resistance, but that was expected. What was not expected was the massive explosion that ripped through the formation, destroying half the battalion in a single blast. Engineers determined it was a human nuclear weapon, a primitive fission device that should not have penetrated Krell shields. But the humans had not tried to penetrate the shields. They had placed the weapon underground and detonated it at close range, channeling the blast through the sewers and subway tunnels directly beneath the Krell formation. The explosion killed thousands of human civilians sheltering in nearby buildings. And the humans had sacrificed their own people to destroy the Krell troops. That was when Vexthor truly understood what he was facing. This was not a species fighting for survival. This was a species that had learned through countless wars among themselves that sometimes you had to be willing to burn everything down to win. They were not just defending their world. They were demonstrating that occupying it would cost more than the Empire could afford to pay. As the first month of the invasion drew to a close, Vexathor sat in his command chamber, reviewing reports and projections. The Dominance's power cores were running at maximum capacity. Shield generators were showing stress fractures. Weapon systems needed maintenance that could only be performed at a shipyard. Every ship in the fleet was reporting similar problems. The humans, fighting with inferior technology, were slowly grinding the Krell war machine to a halt through sheer determination and tactical brilliance born from millennia of fighting each other. They had turned their own world into a weapon, and they were wielding it with brutal efficiency. The emergency council meeting aboard the Dominance was tense. Vexthor stood before holographic projections of the High Command, his report complete, his recommendations clear. The conquest of Earth was not proceeding as planned. The Empire had 3 choices: commit the entire reserve fleet and risk leaving their borders exposed, continue the current campaign and accept unsustainable losses, or withdraw and declare Earth too costly to conquer. High Chancellor Mordex, oldest and most decorated commander in the Empire, I studied the casualty reports with increasing disbelief. How is this possible? They are primitives. They have no shield technology, no energy weapons, no faster-than-light travel. Their most powerful weapons are chemical explosives and fission devices. How are they inflicting these casualties on our forces? Vexthor had anticipated this question. He had spent the past week trying to articulate what made humans different from every other species the Krell had encountered. They fight with something we cannot measure or counter with technology. They call it the human spirit. It is their capacity to adapt, to endure, to refuse defeat even when defeat is logical. But more than that, they have weaponized their own history. They have spent 5,000 years perfecting warfare against themselves. Every tactic, every strategy, every psychological operation we employ, they have already used against each other and developed counters for. He brought up a series of images on the holographic display. Look at their history. They fought wars with swords and spears. They invented gunpowder and fought wars with cannons and muskets. They developed aircraft and fought wars in the skies. They split the atom and built weapons capable of destroying their entire species. And through all of this, they documented everything. They wrote manuals on tactics. They studied their defeats and learned from them. They created academies dedicated to the science of war. Every human soldier has access to thousands of years of accumulated military knowledge. Another commander, General Kickstar, growled in frustration. Knowledge is useless without the technology to implement it. They cannot breach our shields. They cannot match our firepower. How are they winning? They are not trying to match us, Vexthor explained. That is the point. They are not fighting the war we expected. They are fighting their kind of war. They use terrain. They use deception. They use our strengths against us. Our shields protect against energy weapons and high-velocity projectiles, so they use low-velocity explosives at close range. Our sensors detect electronic signatures, so they use runners and written messages. Our tactics assume conventional force deployments, so they scatter into small cells that can operate independently. They are fighting the way they fought each other for millennia, and we have no doctrine for it. He brought up footage from recent engagements. A Krell convoy ambushed in a narrow mountain pass. Human fighters emerging from caves, firing shoulder-launched rockets at the lightly armored rear sections of vehicles, then disappearing before reinforcements arrived. A patrol lured into a building rigged with explosives. The entire structure collapsed on top of them. Communications disrupted by crude but effective jammers built from scavenged electronics. Supply depots infiltrated by humans disguised as refugees, sabotaged from within. Every engagement, Vexthor continued, follows a pattern that makes no logical sense from a purely military standpoint. They trade losses we would consider catastrophic for minimal tactical gains. They sacrifice civilians to destroy military assets. They conduct operations that have no chance of strategic success, but inflict maximum psychological damage. They are not trying to defeat us militarily. They are trying to make the cost of occupation unbearable. The High Chancellor sat back in his chair, processing this information. The Krell Empire had never encountered an enemy like this. Every previous conquest had followed a predictable pattern. Demonstrate superiority. Demand surrender. Occupy key locations. Suppress resistance. Within months, the conquered species would accept their new status and integration into the Empire would begin. But humans were different. They seemed incapable of accepting defeat. They kept fighting even when fighting was irrational. Down on Earth, the resistance was evolving. In the ruins of London, a hastily assembled council of military officers and civilian leaders gathered in an underground bunker 60 meters beneath the rubble. Colonel Sarah Martinez, formerly of the British Special Forces, spread a hand-drawn map across a makeshift table. The map showed Krell positions throughout the city, supply routes, patrol patterns, vulnerable points in their defensive perimeter. "They're learning," she said, her voice hoarse from breathing dust and smoke for weeks. "They've adapted to our ambush tactics. They no longer use predictable patrol routes. They vary their convoy sizes and timing. They've started using drones for reconnaissance. We need to evolve faster than they can adapt." A man named David Chen, who had been a history professor before the invasion, leaned forward. "We need to think about what they don't know about us. They have better technology, but they don't understand human psychology. They don't understand why we keep fighting when we should surrender. That's our advantage. We can do things that don't make sense to them." Martinez nodded. "What do you have in mind?" Chen pulled out a battered book from his pack. It was a collection of ancient military treatises, somehow preserved through the bombardment. Sun Tzu wrote that all warfare is based on deception. The Krell expect us to fight like soldiers. They expect military targets and military tactics. What if we become something else? What if we become their worst nightmare? An enemy they cannot identify, cannot predict, cannot defeat, because we refuse to fight the way they expect. Over the next weeks, the nature of human resistance changed. Instead of direct confrontations, humans began a campaign of psychological warfare. Krell supply depots found their food contaminated with harmless but foul-tasting compounds, and communications were flooded with false reports, forcing the Krell to waste resources investigating phantom threats. Soldiers reported seeing things that sensors could not detect, creating paranoia and distrust in their own equipment. Captured equipment was returned, booby-trapped in ways that seemed random, but created constant fear of using anything taken from humans. In Tokyo, a group of engineers discovered something interesting about Krell technology. The aliens' confidence in their shields had made them careless about electromagnetic pulse protection. A coordinated strike using modified industrial equipment created a localized EMP that temporarily disabled Krell electronics in a 6-block radius. The blackout lasted only minutes, but in those minutes, Inhuman fighters moved in with conventional weapons and inflicted heavy casualties before the systems came back online. The tactics spread. Cities around the world began manufacturing